Okay, this lesson is going to be about Plato, his rationalism, and his case for innate knowledge, specifically as related to the AQA A-level syllabus, and we're going to focus on the slave boy argument from the dialogue Meno, and I'll say a little bit about the concept of forms as a kind of innate knowledge as well, although specifically this won't be something that you'll explicitly be tested on in the exams. It does help, I think, to understand where Plato is coming from. So what are we going to look at? A few things then, the key terminology for the reason as a source of knowledge topic in order to understand Plato as a rationalist, how that's different to empiricism and where innate knowledge fits into this. Then we'll be looking at Plato's case, his argument for innate knowledge to do with the slave boy argument, possible problems or criticisms or issues with this, and then we'll move on to Plato's idea of forms as a kind of innate knowledge, how that links to the modern philosophical debate about what are called universals, and possible issues with this to wrap up. So let's get started. So terminology then to start off with. Very roughly, we've got two sides here that we'll be looking at in the reason as a source of knowledge topic. On the left-hand side, we'll be looking at empiricists like John Locke and David Hume, and they're going to argue that all of our ideas and knowledge are derived ultimately from experience. So Locke in particular is going to give a series of arguments that we'll look at in another lesson, that there's no such thing as innate knowledge. If we want to put this in technical terms, they're going to say that all of the a priori knowledge we have, that is all of the knowledge which is justified without experience, is only analytic. So it's only true through the meanings of the terms. So for an empiricist like Locke, we can know that triangles have three sides or bachelors are unmarried purely by looking at the meanings of the words. But for his kind of philosopher, the empiricist, there's no knowledge about the world, no synthetic knowledge which can be known just by thinking. Synthetic knowledge, which is about the world, comes only through experience, and so is always a posteriori, or justified after or with experience. So that's different then from the rationalists like Plato, who argue that some ideas and knowledge are derived from reason alone, from thinking alone. So there is some innate knowledge, and while Plato didn't use these terms, they came from Kant. The rationalist position can be characterized as believing that there can be some synthetic a priori knowledge. So as we say here on the right hand side of the slide, we can know something about the world, something synthetic, just by thinking. And Plato is going to try and give us a case for that in what we see to come. So Plato's rationalism then, what is Plato trying to argue we have innate knowledge of here? Well, this is where the debate in the dialogue Meno comes in. So Plato wrote in dialogue forms. There would be a series of characters that he would describe a conversation between, and they would try and tease out a particular philosophical argument to clarify a particular kind of position here, with the character of Socrates, Plato's teacher, often taking the part of Plato's kind of views and representing his views on things often. So we have this dialogue, the Meno, and there's a discussion here of whether virtue can be taught. And in the process, there's an exchange, a famous exchange between Socrates, who's representing Plato's position here, and one of the other characters, Meno. So Meno asks, "How will you look for something, Socrates, when you do not know at all what it is? What sort of thing will you set as the target of your search among the things you do not know? If you did meet with it, how would you know that this was the thing that you did not know?" And Socrates replies here, "So I understand what you want to say, Meno. Do you realize that this is a debater's argument you're bringing up? That a man cannot search either for what he knows or for what he does not know. He cannot search for what he knows. Since he knows it, there is no need for a search. nor for what he does not know, since he does not know what to look for. So the exchange continues, and this, I think, leads us into the stuff about innate knowledge, and I'll try and pick apart and clarify the dilemma, the paradox that's been laid out by Meno and Socrates in a minute. But let's just see how Socrates wants to interpret this puzzle here. So Socrates carries on by saying, as the soul is immortal, something which never dies then, and has been born often and has seen everything here and in the underworld, there is nothing that it has not learned. So it is not surprising that it can recollect the things it knew before about virtue and about other things. As the whole of nature is akin and the soul has learned everything, nothing prevents a man, after he has just recalled one thing, the process that people call learning, discovering everything else for himself, if he is brave and does not tire of the search. For searching and learning are simply recollection. So the idea is that there's all this knowledge stored in our souls for Socrates here, and what we're doing when we learn something is actually recollecting this knowledge from some previous existence. So how does this work to try and clarify and maybe make a little bit more formal what Socrates and Meno are talking about here? Well, there's what's called the paradox of inquiry, or Meno's paradox, is really important here. So Plato is starting with this paradox, which just means something which is seemingly logical that leads to a contradiction or illogical conclusion. And the paradox is this. So formally stated, and where I'm using the placeholder F to mean any proposition you might know, it could be stated like this. So for anything F, either one knows F or one does not know F. If one knows the thing F, then one cannot inquire about it because you already know it. If you do not know F, then you cannot inquire about it because you wouldn't even know where to begin to start asking questions. Therefore, for all of the things that we might know F, you cannot inquire about them. So this is the paradox that Plato is dealing with, and that he's setting out as the sort of initial problem for us to solve. So it seems then that we cannot learn anything new. This is the paradox. This is the puzzling conclusion. So in order to illustrate this, Plato puts into the dialogue a conversation between Meno and a slave boy. It's important that he was a slave, as he wouldn't have had any kind of prior education here. So Socrates summons this slave boy, and in a famous scene gets him, merely by questioning him, to see the solution to a geometrical problem which he had never even heard of at the beginning of their conversation. How can this then be possible? Socrates' suggestion is that the demonstration reminded the boy of the answer, as we saw in his quote previously. He knew it already, but until now had forgotten it. Since he knew it already, he must have learned it already, but he did not learn it in this life, so he must have learned it in a prior existence, an earlier life. So the soul for Socrates is immortal, and the knowledge is innate in the boy, present from birth, from a previous existence. So what was the puzzle? You wouldn't need to get into details necessarily about this, but just to explain the puzzle, Socrates draws in the process of this conversation a square on the ground that's 2 feet by 2 feet in its area. Meno's slave agrees that it's 4 square feet, and then Socrates draws another square on the ground that has an area of 8 square feet. Socrates asks the boy, what are the lengths of the sides? The slave incorrectly guesses 4 feet initially. The area would be 16 square feet and not 8. But Socrates asks Meno's slave a series of questions, and then the slave answers the questions correctly and realizes that the sides of a square with an area of 8 feet will be equal to the diagonal of the original 2 times 2 feet square. So the slave boy has worked out this geometrical solution for himself according to Socrates here. Socrates merely asks the boy questions, and the boy kind of works things out using, according to Socrates and Plato, the kind of innate knowledge that he has of mathematics. He's demonstrating something or bringing out something that was already within the boy. So again, just breaking this down, Meno's paradox, as we've seen, states that it is impossible to learn anything because for anything you might learn, either you already know about it or you don't know about it. If you already know about it, learning is unnecessary. If you don't know about it, you won't know how to go about learning it. So Plato's solution to this is to say that learning is a form of remembering or recollection, and there's a Greek term for this, anamnesis. And if we were to put it in premises and conclusions, it would look something like this. So the first premise, the slave boy has no prior teaching about geometry and squares. Socrates only asks the boy questions. He does not teach the boy about squares. And by the end of the questioning, the slave boy is able to grasp an eternal truth about geometry and squares. This truth was not derived from his previous experience or from Socrates' questioning. Therefore, in conclusion, the eternal truth must have existed innately in the boy to begin with. That's the argument that Plato is presenting to us, at least on one interpretation here. And this is supposed to be a case for innate knowledge. So what's wrong with this? Well, one thing I think to get out of the way is the common kind of misinterpretation perhaps of this. It's important to remember that Plato was writing dialogues which were probably a sort of mix of fiction and anecdote and philosophy, and this conversation probably never happened, but it's something that Plato is trying to use to make a point to illustrate something about the nature of our knowledge, and particularly the nature of our knowledge of maths and geometry, which was so important that in Plato's academy, the school that he set up back in ancient Greece, it was supposed to be said across the entrance that no one who knows no geometry shall enter. So important was maths and geometry for the understanding of the world at the time to the ancient Greeks. So what kind of issues can we raise here? Well, often students will say, well, surely the boy is just using his common sense here. He's not kind of recalling anything innate necessarily. He is just kind of presenting some answers to prompts that Socrates is giving him. So it's often objected to this scene that Socrates is leading the boy in the demonstration. The boy is merely picking up on Socrates' hints and using knowledge he has from everyday experience to answer the questions with no need to appeal to innate knowledge. But I think in reply defending Plato, this misses the point. And I'm drawing on Bernard Williams' interpretation here. He points out that if the question had been one in history or geography, the boy could not in any comparable way have come to see the answer. In such subjects, which are about kind of purely about facts, if you like, that need experiential input, you need experience to see the answers. In those subjects, if one doesn't know, you don't know. It's essential that the exercise is in mathematics and involves what's called a priori knowledge, which we've referred to before, knowledge independent of experience. And Plato is offering us here the first theory of such knowledge, where the boy can actually demonstrate these answers just by thinking in a way you could not in something like history or geography. The second issue that we might raise is this business of immortal souls and previous existences. I don't think there's very many people that would necessarily defend Plato on this point today. So I think this is something that we could legitimately raise against him. So the demonstration may well show something about how we kind of become conscious of a priori knowledge. Indeed, many philosophers have agreed with Plato to this extent that such knowledge is in some sense innate. Very few, however, have agreed that this has anything to do with an earlier existence. Why should we believe that there was some original, direct way in which the boy's immortal soul must have originally learned this? Learning in the way that the boy has just learned, the way displayed in the demonstration, is just how we learn mathematics. It's redundant to point to some prior existence to explain this knowledge. Maybe what's going on here is more about a sort of faculty or capacity to grasp certain truths a priori and make certain demonstrations. And it's not evidence of some kind of immortal soul or prior existence in the way that Plato seems to argue. Okay, so we've covered the essential stuff about the slave boy. What I wanted to do was to spend a little bit of time just kind of going a little bit deeper into Plato here and looking at the kind of metaphysics behind what he believes. Metaphysics is the term for the study of the ultimate nature of what exists, or the study of fundamental reality. And Plato has a peculiar kind of metaphysics in believing in what are called forms. You'll see talk sometimes in the textbooks of his theory of forms. And I wanted just to explore that briefly to hopefully deepen our understanding of Plato here. So what is a form? What does this have to do with innate knowledge? Well, we focused on maths and geometry, and Plato believed that mathematical and geometrical concepts such as a triangle don't concern this or that particular triangle, but seem to be about an ideal triangle which the mind grasps through reason as opposed to sense experience. And we can all understand the idea of the number 3 or a perfect circle, even though we've never actually seen something that matches that in the outside world. And it's this ideal concept which we grasp just by thinking through our reason rather than our senses that represents genuine knowledge for Plato. And the name that he gives to these ideal concepts is forms, which are supposedly implanted in our immortal souls before birth and hence are innate. And hopefully you can see now then the link between the forms and the slave boy's innate knowledge of geometry that we discussed previously. So although this might seem odd, there are a number of good reasons for putting forward something like the forms, and we can potentially dismiss, as we've talked about before, the whole idea of a previous existence or an immortal soul, but there is something unusual about the way we understand certain kinds of concepts, which in contemporary philosophy are more commonly referred to as universals. You'll see talk of the problem of universals, as they're about something that many particular things have in common or share universally. For example, circularity is common to all circles. That's a universal in this sense. So to build on this, let's just explain what a universal is a little bit and have a look at a couple of reasons for believing in them. So universals then are patterns common to certain things we experience, like triangularity, redness, roundness, and they exist at least as objects of thought. After all, we can meaningfully talk about them, and we know certain things about them. We know, for example, that whatever is triangular will be three-sided, that its angles will always add up to the sum of two right angles, and so on. But unlike, say, a billiard ball, you can't perceive triangularity through the five senses. Can't pick it up and put it on the table or in any other way interact with it in the way that you would interact with a material object. So if it's an object of some sort, then it is what philosophers would call an abstract object. So the idea of triangularity isn't just associated with a specific triangle, it's something which seems to be separate from the specific or particular triangles that you might draw on a sheet of paper or see in a sort of building plan. Numbers as well exist at least as objects of thought, as we know from our grasp of mathematical truths and carrying out calculations, but numbers aren't in any obvious way material things. So the written numeral 2 isn't the same as the number 2 any more than the Roman numeral 2 is or any more than the name Joe Biden is the same thing as the man Joe Biden. So numerals like 2 and the Roman numeral 2 are just labels we use to talk about the number 2. And nor would erasing every instance of numerals like 2 or 2 in the Roman form that anyone has ever written somehow destroy the number 2. It wouldn't suddenly make 2 plus 2 equals 4 false, for example. So universals such as triangularity, numbers and other mathematical objects are abstract objects. They're not reducible to the kind of particular labels we give them. They're separate in some sense and exist over and above those things. So if we're understanding these universals then, what Plato called forms, as abstract objects, in what sense do they exist? If they have an existence separate to human minds, this could support Plato's argument that such an ideal, non-material object is real and in some sense grasped by reason. So let's just look at 2 brief reasons to support this. Something called the one over many argument suggests that universals like triangularity and redness are not reducible to any particular triangle or red thing, nor even to any collection of triangles or red things. For any particular triangle or red thing, or even the whole collection of these things, could go out of existence, and yet triangularity and redness could come to be exemplified or instantiated, shown once again in some new triangle or red thing. So these universals could also be, and often are, exemplified even when no human mind is aware of this fact. Hence, or therefore, triangularity, redness, and other universals are neither material things nor collections of material things, nor are they dependent on human minds for their existence. They exist as an abstract conceptual thing, somehow separate from human minds. And this is exactly what I think Plato was trying to get at with the idea of a form. Secondly, and more in line with what we've talked about with Meno, is the argument from geometry. So in geometry, we deal with perfect lines, perfect angles, perfect circles, and the like, and discover objective and necessary truths about them. For example, it's an objective and necessary truth that the angles of a Euclidean triangle add up to the sum of 2 right angles. We discovered this rather than invented it, and it couldn't change even if we wanted it to. So it was true before any human mind existed and would remain true even if every human being went out of existence. Since these truths, it said, are objective and necessary, they cannot be mere constructs of our minds. They exist, again, independently, in some abstract way, which seems to illustrate a case for something like Plato's ideal, perfect concepts. So there is a whole host of criticisms, debates and arguments over the existence and meaning of a universal, and I recommend, if you're interested, the Internet Encyclopedia of Philosophy entry on the problem of universals. But I'm just going to outline one brief issue with this here. So I've called this the problem of interaction. This is a problem which crops up with a lot of what are called dualist philosophies. And just to explain this, a problem arises then considering that this world of the forms apprehended or grasped by reason and the world of physical objects apprehended by the senses are very different. The forms exist in this metaphysical sense, so beyond the physical or natural world, and we exist in the physical world. It seems that these 2 worlds are so fundamentally different that they are too distinct and separate to interact with one another. There doesn't seem to be much point then in talking of a realm of eternal and perfect metaphysical forms, as they're so disconnected from the changing and imperfect world that we live in. Plato is relying on a peculiar and non-natural kind of thing to explain our knowledge, which empiricists would argue can't be experienced or properly justified. So if we're talking about the perfect form of a circle, how is that supposed to interact with or represent the circles or circular objects which we see with our senses? if you want to take other kinds of ideas which people have postulated as universals or put forward in Plato's name here, like beauty perhaps, or justice, how do these interact with the physical manifestations of beautiful things or of just acts? You could reply, so defenders of Plato, defenders of the metaphysical forms, might argue that the two distinct realms of the physical and non-physical are in fact connected by our rationality. In the same way that we can use rationality to connect with non-physical mathematical truths, the philosopher is somehow able to use a similar process to connect with the metaphysical forms. I'll leave it to you to make up your mind whether this makes sense or whether this is in some sense overcomplicating the theories of knowledge that we need to put forward to account for mathematics and geometry. But Plato has a series of arguments that he can offer in defense of his case here. So to wrap up, what have we looked at then, and what can you remember? So what is the definition of rationalism? What is Meno's paradox, or the paradox of inquiry? Why is the slave boy said to have innate knowledge? What problems are there with the slave boy argument, and how might Plato reply to his critics? That's the essential stuff. If you're feeling brave, you could get into this stuff about forms then. What is a form? What arguments are there to suggest that they exist? And what is the problem of interaction, and how could Plato possibly respond to this?